There are many divisions within Christianity. One division is between free will and Calvinism. Those who believe in free will teach that people can decide to accept or reject Christ's offer for salvation, but Calvinists believe that God chooses some to be saved and leaves others to go to hell. Which reminds me of a joke. A Calvinist goes to heaven and he sees two doors. One is labeled free will and the other is marked predestination. Of course, he goes through the doorway that's marked predestination. An angel appears to him and says, "You can't be here. You chose this door and you don't believe in free will." So he goes through the free will doorway. The angel appears again and tells him, "You can't be here. You don't believe in free will." The Calvinist replies, "But I had no choice." Welcome to Central Baptist Church and the Fellowship Sunday Morning Bible Study. We are answering questions that you've always wondered about, and the current question is, what about predestination and election? Can you explain it? Well, I don't know if I can or not, but I'm going to try to continue. Last week I remarked that Calvinism is illogical. It's logically unfair because it is partial. And since God is impartial, Calvinism violates a fundamental characteristic of God, which is impartiality. Calvinism assumes that God created some people for the express purpose of going to hell. If God were fair under Calvinism, God would have to create all people with the express purpose of going to heaven. Furthermore, if God predetermines everything as Calvinists believe, He is responsible for every murder, rape, theft, and every kind of evil that exists. Many Calvinists freely acknowledge that. But additionally, people have no moral responsibility. So in fairness, how do you punish someone who is predestined to do evil? For God predetermined that they would do evil. Much of the confusion in this issue lies with two words, foreknew and predestined, and their coupling in Romans chapter 8 and verse 29. So we'll read that. Romans 8:29 says this, "For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren." We'll just stop there and define a couple of words. First of all, let's talk about foreknew. The word foreknew seems simple enough to define, and I think it's simple enough to define, but the Calvinists make it a little more complicated. Let me tell you about the word. It simply means to know beforehand. It is literally a compound word made up of before and know. And so it has an obvious definition, to know beforehand. It is used in the Bible in passages that make it undeniably to know beforehand. Look at 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 17. "You therefore, beloved, since you know this beforehand, beware lest you also fall from your own steadfastness, being led away with the error of the wicked." And so Peter says here, you have prior knowledge of doctrine. It also appears in Acts chapter 26 and verse 5. In this passage, it speaks of people having prior knowledge of Paul and his reputation. "They knew me from the first, if they were willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee." So in both of these cases, in Peter and also in Acts, the word is used in its simplest form to mean to know something in advance, something from the past. Some say foreknowledge means to cause something to occur in advance. And here is the rub. It is, though, an interpretation. You have to interpret the word, which literally means to know something beforehand, to mean to know something beforehand and thus cause it to come into existence. Here is the rationale. If God knows the future, then He causes the future. Otherwise, He would change the future from what the future is to what the future would be according to His will. so he wills the future. Knowledge, though, does not necessitate action. Suppose that you watch a 2-year-old child waddle across the street, and you also see a semi-truck barreling down that street. And at that split moment when you see this child walk in front of the semi, you know that the semi can't stop, and the child can't move, and you know the child is going to be hit by that truck. That is foreknowledge. Now, our foreknowledge is very limited, and there is a bit of assumption built into every one of these events, but nevertheless, you get the idea. I know the future, you know the future, you know the child is going to be hit by the truck, but you didn't create the future. You would never create such a circumstance as to have an innocent child hit by a truck. But if God's knowledge creates the future, we have a similar situation in every event of life. He caused me to write this lesson in number 2 pencil. He caused me to not dot the I that's in these notes. He caused 464,000 murders in 2017. And he caused hundreds of thousands of people to die. And hundreds of thousands of orphans, hundreds of thousands of widows, hundreds of thousands of missing jobs, hundreds of thousands of houses that were lost because they could not pay the payment because now one of the breadwinners is dead. And he's thrown thousands, hundreds of thousands of families into poverty. If God's knowledge causes the future, he did all of this and more, plus he created people in order to send them to hell. And apparently, God wants the world to suffer. Well, part of the answer to this problem is to define that word foreknowledge correctly, which is to simply know something in advance, not to cause it to happen. Another is to understand that God has 2 wills. He has an active will and he has a passive will. His active will causes things to happen. So for instance, you pray for a baby and God answers the prayer. God has a plan for your life, has a particular job, a certain spouse. These are things that are God's active will. God gives you the baby, God gives you a job. He has these things intentional for you. But he also has a passive will, where God allows things to happen. Passive will is anything that's not active. Let's kind of look at this in the way of how a parent would raise his child. A child wants to go out to a certain friend's house and the father says to the son, I really don't think you should go there because there's trouble at that neighborhood. And the son says, well, I'm going to go anyway. And the father, instead of restraining him, lets him go. So you have a passive will. The father could stop the child, but he does not stop the child. Romans chapter 8 and verse 29 has a second word that's important for us to study, and that's the word predestined. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. The word predestined is as simple as the word foreknew. It means to arrange beforehand. It's made up of a compound word, the preface pre, which means before, and the word destined, which means a decree. So to make a decree before the decree goes into effect. No one really disputes the meaning of this word. Calvinists say, yeah, that's what it means. Free will people say, yeah, that's what it means. It's what it means. But some say that the word foreknowledge and predestination are synonyms, or at least very closely related. This is the problem. It is not the natural definition of foreknowledge to say that it means to cause something to happen in the future. And second, why would Paul use both these words, foreknowledge and predestined, if they had the same meaning or a near meaning? There's no reason to use both of them. You would just use one or the other. And third, the listing in Romans chapter 8, verses 29 through 30 requires that they have separate definitions. I want you to note the word order as I read this in this passage. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. There is a progression, a chronological progression here, and it's intentional by Paul. Let's look at it again. There is foreknowledge first of all, and that's knowledge of the future. There's predestination, which creates the future. There is a calling, in which God calls people to salvation. Those he calls, he justifies. That is, he erases their sin. And those he justified, he finally glorifies. That is, he recreates them so that they can never sin again, have a perfect body, and etc. Predestination, though, is based always on foreknowledge. Think about it. If I bake a cake, the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to envision a cake in my mind, or I'm going to look at a picture of a cake in a cookbook. I am going to use both foreknowledge and predestination. The foreknowledge is when I see the cake in my mind. The predestination is when I gather the ingredients and plan to bake the cake. Foreknowledge sees obstacles that might prevent something from actually happening, that thing that I would like to happen in my mind. For instance, if I see in the future that I have no sugar, or as I'm gathering my ingredients, I see I have no sugar, well, that means that my cake, if I decide to make it, will turn out bad. The sinner rejects salvation. That's what God sees in his foreknowledge, and so that sinner will not be saved. In fact, that sinner he may never issue a call to, because he knows if he did, the sinner would reject it anyway. Or he might issue the call, knowing that the sinner is going to reject the call for other purposes. God's predestination involves some being saved. In other words, God predestines some people to be saved, and it's based on his foreknowledge. He knows who will accept salvation. He creates circumstances in which they will hear the gospel. A lot of people worry about places where the gospel's never been preached, and they think, well, it's not fair. But it is fair, because God would never let a person be born who he knew would be saved if they heard the gospel. And so he has people's souls to be born into bodies in locations where they might not hear the gospel, because he knows that those people, if they did hear the gospel, would reject Christ. But listen to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 2. Elect, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. Peter is saying that election happens after foreknowledge. Elect according to the foreknowledge of God. Election is God's call to salvation. God issues the call of salvation to many people. Those that accept it become the elect. And Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8 helps us understand this a little bit more, if it's not a little bit more complicated. Where he says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself, it is a gift of God." Now this is really complicated in English. It's a little easier to understand in Greek, which is the original language that this was written in. Let me just say this. The grammatical construction is such that both grace and faith are the gift of God. In other words, God gives those he foreknew both grace and faith. Grace to be saved and faith to believe. Both of them are gifts, but both must be accepted in order to be effective. Mark chapter 9 and verse 20 helps us with this. Okay? In Mark chapter 9, there's a little boy who has been throwing himself into a fire and burning himself. It's not really the little boy that's doing it, it's demons that are within the boy. And so they bring him to Jesus so Jesus might exorcise the demons and save the little boy's life. So we're going to jump right in here in verse 20 of Mark chapter 9. Then they brought him to him, that is Jesus. And when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And he often has thrown him both in the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on him and help us. Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Now, listen to this verse. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Do you see what's happening here? This man has recognized that he does not have faith. Jesus has said faith is a condition for his son to be saved from the demons. But Jesus offers the faith. Now, how do I know Jesus offers the faith? Because the man said, I don't have faith. Please give me faith. And Jesus said, well, if you have faith, your son will be saved. And his son was saved. Listen to verse 25. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So the man recognized he had no faith, Jesus offered faith, and the man received the faith. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourself, it is a gift of God. Predestination is true. Some things are designed before they take place. Foreknowledge, though, always predates predestination, which means salvation is totally of God. Sinners, though, must accept it or reject it of their own free will. Thank you. May God bless you.